Today is Tuesday, November 27th, and I'm going to give you some of my favorite DraftKings picks for today's 10-game slate. Let's dive in. Joe Holka here. Welcome to another daily fantasy sports and betting video. If this is your first time here and you want to become a profitable DraftKings player and get better at betting, start now by subscribing to the channel and clicking that bell so that you don't miss anything along the way. If you want to take that a step further, definitely check out the description below. All the links to Twitch and Discord can be found there. That's where the live streams and the community is going to continue to talk about this slate well after this video is published. So definitely would want you guys to get involved in the community if you haven't already. It's been a ton of fun to kind of talk through some of these decisions after a lot of news comes out, even after this video comes out. So come join us. You won't regret it. Lots to get to today. We do have a 10-game slate to talk about. So we're going to start on the team rating page over at Fantasy Labs. The first thing that I like to do is always kind of get an idea of what the slate looks like from a peripheral stats perspective. So what that means, if you guys are new to these videos, is I'm more or less looking for situations that shape up really well for teams to get a lot of shots on goal against teams that give up a lot of shots on goal. It's pretty simple. The best way to attack NHL from a DraftKings perspective is really try and stack those up, and then it's kind of a luxury, if anything, if we get some goals along the way. So that's what we really want to target. And I like to start on this page even before I look on the Vegas page because, yeah, goals definitely matter, but you still want to build in some type of floor. So that's what I'm here to talk to you guys about today, 10 games. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on some specific stacks that I like as well. But looking at this page, it's really not too surprising to see Carolina at the top of the Corsi 4. A lot of that has to do with how much they shoot as a team, not necessarily this matchup. So Carolina, by far the highest Corsi 4 over the past month on the entire slate. If we're just looking at Corsi against over that same time period, Montreal, well outside the top 5 on today's slate. So I do think that Carolina is always kind of in play because of how much they shoot. Definitely not one of the best spots on the slate. Speaking about one of the best spots on the slate, I love Philly tonight against Ottawa. It's really not a big surprise about how bad this Ottawa team has been this year, giving up the most Corsi on the slate, but also a ton of goals as well. So while we're here, just looking at this, the Coyotes have given up a lot of shots as well, but they haven't given up a ton of goals. If we're looking at just some teams that have struggled to kind of score goals, at least the Wild are somewhat in the top half, so we'll talk about them. But I do want to circle back to Philly. It's just a smash spot for these guys tonight. Their prices are a little bit expensive for a couple of guys, which we'll talk about when we get into some more of the players, but do think that they're very stackable today against this Ottawa team at home, and that's definitely going to be one I'm prioritizing. They have the highest goals for expectation and the best matchup rating on the entire slate as well. Another one that stood out to me right away is what you see right below this, Tampa Bay against Another one that stood out to me right away looking at that page is was Tampa Bay at home against Anaheim. And again, Anaheim is one of those teams that we've been targeting most of the year for shots against. So if we look at the year, they are the 5th highest on the year. If we just look over at their Corsi against over the past month, top 3 on the slate right there with the Coyotes and Ottawa. So definitely think it's a really solid spot for Tampa Bay at home. Very stackable as well as Philly. We'll have to see what the prices are on those guys. I bet they've been a little bit elevated for the matchup, but you never know. Sometimes DraftKings makes some mistakes. As far as the matchup rating, they do have the 2nd highest matchup rating on the slate as well. So at first glance, those look like the 2 best spots to me. It's interesting to see San Jose towards the top as well. It's probably more of a Carolina type situation here where they do shoot a lot as a team. Buffalo actually has been playing really well. They're on just a tear lately. One of the best teams in that division, 2nd, I believe. So interesting spot against the Sharks team that is super talented and shoots a lot, but they are on the road. So I'm not sure how interested I would be, especially at the price points of some of the guys on the Sharks. But we'll have to look deeper and see what those guys have been doing lately. Outside of that, guys, I definitely think those are the top spots to attack. If we're just kind of looking at the goals for expectation, always think that Winnipeg is in play just because of how easy it is to stack this team, and there's a lot of options that really like to shoot the puck as well, and that's always what is most important to me. So if we're just looking at the Corsi against, we'll see that Pittsburgh's a pretty tough matchup, but it's not unbeatable. If we're looking at the goals against for Pittsburgh, at least it's in kind of the middle of the pack. So not a crazy matchup for Winnipeg. I could definitely see them having some success in this spot. They are a team that does have a ton of offense. As you can see, they have the 3rd highest goals for over the past month and really like to kind of stack that up in tournaments. Think it's a pretty decent spot for them as well. All right, so against the Coyotes, we probably should talk about the Minnesota Wild today. It is a pretty good spot relative to how many shots this team has given up. We talked about how their goals against on the year wasn't that great, but over the past month, they've actually given up quite a few more goals lately. So it is a pretty decent spot for the Wild. We'll have to dig into that a little bit deeper. Their Corsi 4 expectations a little bit lower than I would like. Has to do with how they just don't shoot a ton as a team, but they've been highly efficient. They've been scoring a ton of goals. So I do think they're very much in play, especially in this matchup. And another team that I'm kind of looking at today is going to be the Nashville Predators. If we're just looking at some of these teams that are outside the top tier in Corsi 4, definitely think it's a really strong matchup against this Colorado team who has been not great lately as well. So I think that those are the kind of teams that stand out on this page. Let's see if we uncovered anything over on Vegas. Wow, so a 4-goal implied total for the Philadelphia Flyers. Definitely think that that's probably warranted, just given this matchup against Ottawa. I think that it's a decent to see them like kind of over the 200 mark for money line. We don't see that each and every slate, but both of these teams that we've already talked about are heavy favorites, which makes a ton of sense. One thing I found on a 10-game slate is people get a little bit too cute. I do think that these guys will carry a ton of ownership at the top, but at the same time, 10 games, it's going to be relatively spread out. There's going to be people that want to take shots on some of these other teams and be really contrarian. One thing that I do like that both of these games are one of the first games of the entire slate. So one thing that you can do is if you do roll out a Tampa Bay stack or you do roll out a Philly stack, maybe run it back with one of the teams that starts later in the night. So maybe you run it back. Probably won't be able to do it with Winnipeg because they're so expensive. But if we go down a little bit, there should be some cheaper options here that stand out that you might be able to get exposure to in the later game. And then one of the best things that you can really do is be able to pivot. A lot of people don't use late swap, and that's one of the biggest holes, I think, in a lot of people's DFS games, especially in hockey, when every single game that starts, you have a pretty good idea of where you're at in the tournaments, especially if you have a lot of heavy exposure to these 7 o'clock games and things aren't going well. You literally have to pivot to what you think are going to be some lower owned plays if you want to give yourself a chance in tournaments. So wanted to mention that. Outside of that, not a ton of surprises on this page. A lot of teams we've already talked about. So let's jump over into some of the players. All right, back at the Fantasy Labs Trends tool. Again, guys, if you want to get kind of the same research tools that I'm using, you can definitely check out Fantasy Labs. Have a link in the description below. If you like my work and want to support my work, that's one of the best ways to do it is by clicking that link if you do want to take advantage of the tools they have there. Really love the tools they have for NHL in particular. So on the Trends tool, one of the things I like to do with this page is really sort out some of the stats that I think really matter at NHL. So looking at the center position, just sorting by Corsi, there's a lot of plays that definitely stand out today. So one of the things that stood out to me right away was Sean Couturier at 5,900. So this might be a good way to get access to this Philly team, guys. He's been someone that has been shooting a good amount lately. He does have a ton of upside, so that's what I like. So 8-shot game in here, a 5-shot game in here. Does block some shots as well, which you do kind of need at the center position in my opinion. But the thing that really stands out to me is his price at 5,900, and he's in the 99th percentile in Corsi over the past month. So Corsi is one of those things that really matters at the center position. You'll hear me kind of talk about that pretty much every day, but I really like Couturier. I think he's super underpriced at that spot. So not surprising to see Connor McDavid at the top. Of course, he pretty much always is. At 8K, I do think he's pretty expensive relative to his implied total, but it could be a decent one-off situation, especially if you think you'll get some lower ownership on him. Not one of the core plays that I'm on today. Couturier at 5,900 seems really solid. Another one that really stood out to me was Steven Stamkos at 5,700. So if we're just looking at guys that I think are super underpriced, Stamkos definitely fits that bill in this matchup against the Anaheim Ducks. So 92nd percentile in shots over the past month, 90th in shots plus blocks, but a decent amount on the power play, of course, 92nd percentile there. So I think at 5,700, he's one that definitely stands out to me. Jeff Carter is somewhat interesting. I don't love this Kings team, but targeting these games that are on the West Coast, it is in Vancouver, you can get a little bit of late swap activity with some of these teams. So one of the things that I did like somewhat about LA, if you really want to get contrarian, is Vancouver's actually allowed the most power play opportunities in the entire league this year. So I definitely think that if you wanted to get crazy and get a lower owned play, Carter could be one of those guys for you, especially because of his usage on the power play in particular. So 96th percentile there. Outside of that, guys, there's a ton really to pay up for at some of the other positions. I do prefer Couturier, I think, if I'm going in the mid-range at this spot. Definitely think that it's a tough matchup for Jack Eichel. Don't really want to pay 7K for him, but 99th percentile on shots. Can't really argue with that. Couturier, again, I guess I didn't mention 99th percentile on shots plus blocks as well. So that's the one that stands out to me here. Nathan McKinnon against Nashville, pretty tough matchup for him as well. Yeah, so I think that's pretty much where I'm at in this spot. You can definitely make an argument for Eric Staal for the Wild today too. So 90th percentile shots plus blocks, 92nd in shots, 82nd on the power play. So he's someone that definitely makes a ton of sense. He's been playing really well lately for this Minnesota team. Has a 7-shot game, but at least 4 shots in his last 3. So definitely think that Staal could be a guy we could go back to. Anytime we get a goal scorer that's been streaky like this, kind of trying to ride that out, especially at his price point at 6,300. Definitely think in this matchup against the Coyotes, he's one of the guys that I really like at the center position today. On the value side of things, one of the guys that almost always stands out to me at the center position is Lucas Wallmark. So 97th percentile in Corsi, 90th in shots plus blocks. For just 4,200, I do think he's a really solid option if you want to pay down for this Carolina team that does shoot the puck a ton. So I think that he's squarely in play. Tougher spot for Derek Stepan, but his price is getting back to a point where I'm really kind of fire back at Stepan again. He has been kind of a higher volume shooter for us this year than in years past. Probably has a decent amount to do with this Coyotes team. He's going to be heavily involved. He's going to give you at least 2 or 3 shots. So I think at 4,500, he's at least in play. I definitely think that there's some better options, but that's kind of what I'm looking at the center position for value. The winger position is super interesting. So I talked a lot about this Tampa Bay team, and we'll get to that again in stacks, but Andre Case on the other side of this game is super underpriced at 4,800. 99th percentile in shots, 99th in shots plus blocks, 96th in power play shots, 95th in Corsi. Guys, at 4,800, I think he's a really solid one-off play. I'm not necessarily wanting to stack up the Anaheim side of this game, but I do think that Case is super safe at that price point. And then we have a bunch of guys that I'm willing to pay up for, honestly. So I think that Patrick Laine is interesting in tournaments against this Pittsburgh team. Evander Kane, Jeff Skinner, both of these guys against San Jose. It's not a great matchup, but these are high-volume shooters that are probably somewhat matchup independent as well. Evander Kane, his price is finally getting up there. 5,900 still seems like a bargain. On FanDuel, he's a little bit more expensive, but I think that that's a good spot. Jonathan Marchessault is always one of those guys that's one of the top shot predictions of the entire night at 6,200. He's decent tournament option, I think, against this Chicago team, especially if there's people that have a little bit of recency bias because he hasn't really gotten there for us lately as far as the goals side of things. But a high-volume shooter that has been struggling a little bit to get on the score sheet, definitely want to be out in front of that in tournaments. Guys, outside of that, I really don't love this position in general today. I think that there's a lot of different ways you can go. I do really like Case, though, if you want to pay down and maybe pay up for one of those other centers that we talked about. But there's really not a ton to love. I think that the winger position is going to be more of me trying to correlate with some of my stacks. Someone like Nikita Kucherov at 7,300, I think he's probably overpriced, but 90th percentile in shots plus blocks, which is fine, but 94th on the power play. So if you're going to try and correlate Stamkos, definitely want to get Kucherov in those lineups. I think he's a really solid play today. He's been really active as far as his assists. A guy that is pretty expensive, but in this matchup, I definitely think has incredible upside. Another guy for Philly that I think is somewhat interesting is James Van Riemsdyk. So if you do want to correlate that line, it definitely makes a lot of sense. 86th percentile in shots isn't that great, but at 5,400, especially in your stacks, I think that if you're trying to stack up that power play, 90th percentile in power play shots, he's one of the guys that you want to get in there. Value is really gross for winger, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this page. We have a couple guys I guess you could consider, but I'm really not that interested in any of these guys. We don't have anyone over the 81st percentile in shots. We have a couple guys that are standing out for Corsi, Sam Gagner, Nikolai Ehlers. Really not that interested in any of these guys, so let's move on. At defense, I'm going to keep firing at Matt Dumba, 98th percentile in shots, 99th in shots plus blocks, 98th in power play shots. He says everything that I'm looking for in a defenseman on DraftKings at just 6,100. Love this range for a defenseman in general tonight. Dumba, Yossi, definitely think that those are two of the top peripheral stat options on the entire slate, and they're pretty underpriced. So I definitely like both of these guys. Dumba is probably my favorite defenseman, especially in that price range, but you can definitely make an argument for some of these other guys. I think that one of the guys that always kind of stands out to me is Dustin Byfuglien, especially in your Winnipeg stacks. As far as a guy that shoots a lot, but hasn't really been that great this year overall. Again, those are the guys that I really want to try and be early on overall. So as far as ones that are used on the power play a lot, these Carolina guys, Justin Falk, Dougie Hamilton, if you are trying to stack up Carolina and you think that they can get to Montreal, I think those are guys that you definitely want to include on your tournament teams. Ton of shot upside there. And it's not probably surprising to any of you guys, but Shane Gostisbehere for Philadelphia, even though he hasn't been that great lately, I definitely think that he's someone you have to have on these power play stacks. He's definitely not safe. I wouldn't go anywhere near Gostisbehere on a cash game tonight just because of how little he's shot relative to his kind of longer term averages. But I think that he's fine, especially if you're stacking up Philly. 91st percentile in shots is not really what we normally see from Gostisbehere, so I would expect him to regress back to his longer term mean in the near future, and definitely think that he's a solid play. The value is pretty decent at defense. One of the teams that really stands out, at least for guys that are underpriced on the back end, is the Arizona Coyotes. Jakob Chychrun, someone that has been battling through a ton of injuries, but we do know when he is in, he's not afraid to shoot the puck, and he blocks a ton of shots as well. So if you're just looking for a floor option, look at this, guys. He basically is the 94th percentile in shots plus blocks, 3,900. I think that he's at a really nice price point if you want to punt off one of the defense or your flex position. Oliver Ekman-Larsson, a little more upside than Chychrun for sure, but definitely think you're getting decent peripherals with him as well. 92nd percentile in shots. Another guy I feel like we talk about a lot is Jakob Trouba. So 89th percentile in Corsi, 87th in blocks. That's where you're getting a lot of his equity from a block side of things. But if Winnipeg ends up being relatively popular in tournaments, you do get a little bit of kind of leverage by going the Trouba route since he's not on that first power play unit. To be completely honest, the value isn't that great today. So it's shaping up to be one of those slates where kind of a middle-of-the-road roster construction really makes sense, which might make stacks a little bit more difficult. But let's go ahead and take a look at what some of the lines are looking like. All right, so this Tampa Bay power play is super interesting to me. So Steven Stamkos at 5,700. The price really doesn't make a lot of sense to me, to be completely honest, especially in this matchup against Anaheim. I think he's one of the best plays on the slate just because of the upside that he has, how much he's been shooting in general. It makes the price point for Nikita Kucherov a little bit more palatable. So if you think of Stamkos and Kucherov as more of like a combined unit as far as their salary, I think that they make a lot more sense together than apart. Definitely think that Stamkos can still be a decent one-off play at that price, but it's really hard for me to play Kucherov without Stamkos, if that makes sense. So Braden Point at 7,200, he's going to give you a decent amount of upside in tournaments, of course. Just the amount of goals that he's been scoring and how involved he is as far as your correlation. Definitely think he's one you have to think about at his price point. JT Miller. So if you're really trying to get the cheap access to this power play unit, I still prefer Stamkos, of course, but I think that it's interesting at 4,800 when we don't like a ton of the value in place. Victor Hedman, a guy that hasn't been as great for us this year as far as his shots plus blocks, because he hasn't been blocking as many shots. But at the top of this power play, he's going to be feeding over those one-timers to Stamkos, Kucherov on the other side of this power play unit as well as far as the structure is concerned. But definitely think that this first unit is definitely in play. Philly, so mentioned that Couturier at 5,900 is one of the guys that I'm targeting on this slate. This really sets up well as far as the mid-range. So I mentioned Gostisbehere in tournaments, and then Giroux at 6,600. Again, probably overpriced relative where his shot totals are, but in tournaments, definitely think you can add him to your stacks. If I had to choose one guy to go with Couturier, but it's probably going to be James Van Riemsdyk. Definitely think that his shot volume is a little bit safer. Again, another guy that hasn't gotten on the score sheet lately that I think could positively progress. So definitely think that this top unit is something that I'm looking at. Ivan Provorov at 4,500 is super interesting. Kind of the Trouba side of things. Hasn't given us a ton of upside as far as his point totals, but really nice peripherals from him in general. And in the past, he's more of a long-term guy that we're always targeting for some of those peripheral stats. I'm not a big fan of Minnesota in general because their correlation is kind of all over the place relative to their first line and their power play units. So Stahl at 6,300, like him a lot, but I like him in different lineups than Dumba. So Dumba has me leaning a little bit more towards the second unit, but again, like don't love any of these guys. I think that Dumba makes for a really good one-off play, not necessarily stacks for me today. One stack that always makes a little bit more sense to me is the Winnipeg Jets. It's not the best matchup against Pittsburgh, but definitely think that they're in play. I kind of like them as a little lower end, or as a lower owned option today. Bufflin at 6K, Wheeler 6,400, Scheifele at 68, and then Line at 79. Like these guys are pretty expensive, especially if we're going to pair them together. So I don't know if the slate really lends itself well to stacking Winnipeg up as far as where the value's at, but you'll definitely get them at some lower ownership because of that. All right, guys, going to go ahead and end it there for today. Going to talk about tiers again over in the Discord because I really like kind of how that was going. I've been doing those on these videos in the past, but do want to keep these videos a little bit shorter. So let's go ahead and move over to the Discord if you guys want to talk about the tiers tonight. We've been talking about that quite a bit. And then definitely subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I talked about that before, but hit that notification bell. Let me know in the comments what you think about some of these new overlays. Definitely testing some stuff out still, but kind of having a little bit of fun with it. Let me know what you guys think, and really kind of getting involved in the community has been my kind of biggest surprise, but definitely one of the things that's made me the most happy about doing this YouTube and Twitch thing full time now. It's been great kind of getting to know some of you guys over in Discord, and it's been fun kind of to teach you guys kind of the right way to go about NHL. There's a lot of stuff coming as far as content, but I appreciate you guys that have been here for a while, and for the new people, come join us. As far as the community is concerned, it's been a lot of fun. So if you haven't checked any of the Twitch streams, definitely consider watching the one tonight. I do play a lot of NFL as well, so I'm going to review my lineup in the $1,500 entry over on DraftKings last week, and then we do have a subscriber contest going on where there's going to be a bunch of free subscriptions to Twitch coming out today during that live stream. So it's at 9 Eastern time. If you're interested in getting a free subscription, definitely don't miss the one tonight. So that's going to go ahead and do it for today, guys. Good talk. See you out there.